In the beginning, the main ways to communicate religious faith were the spoken word, ink on paper, art, and architecture. Those channels changed little until the late Middle Ages, when movable type made mass printing possible and allowed sacred scriptures and religious tracts to become widely accessible. Only in the early 20th century did the means of communication really begin to multiply. Even so, in the early 1920s, studies showed that many religious groups and social service organizations knew very little about how to use these new media. These important institutions and groups were overlooking amazing new opportunities for informing the public about their purposes and goals, their activities, and why they deserved a hearing, acceptance, and support. By this time, some pioneering communicators in religion here and there were experimenting with some of the new technologies in printing, news handling, and broadcasting. These innovators were beginning to adapt and use secular-style publicity. There were complaints from some quarters that these secular pursuits trivialized the cause and made it like a circus. But creative people were waking up to new possibilities for witness and outreach. In the face of such neglected challenges, 21 representatives of a dozen denominations and agencies met in Washington, D.C., November 27, 1929. In the Washington Hotel, a few blocks from the United States Capitol building, they formed what they chose to call the Religious Publicity Council, which made its own news in the next day's papers. They elected Herbert B. Rugg of the National Council of Congregational Churches as the first president. This was just 1 month after one of the century's great cataclysms, the stock market crash of October 1929. In that first meeting, the focus was primarily on working with one medium, newspapers. They emphasized religion as valid news. They considered such questions as how to get newspapers to recognize this source of news and how to present such news to the papers. They also explored ways to help pastors and other leaders prepare usable newspaper copy. In that first meeting, they voiced opinions on advertising, on how to make religious language more understandable to more people. They may have recalled the advice of an early advertising man who said, "Boil it down. When you have a story you want to tell, say it quickly, say it well. Don't talk an hour when 15 minutes will tell the tale and all that's in it." The new Religious Publicity Council immediately became a forum for such concerns. It was a small step, but a long journey in a significant direction had begun. At the same time, major events were at work reshaping 20th century life. There was the Great Depression of the 30s, which began a massive change in the role of government. Prohibition ended. World War II followed, changing life for everyone in the 40s and altering the pace of history for decades to come. The New World Order made possible phenomenal advances in science and technology. There were gains and losses in human rights. Within the faith groups, there was unprecedented growth. There were some disappointments. There was cooperation. There were disputes. There were advances and declines. In the first 2 decades of the Religious Publicity Council, the 30s and 40s, brought changes in the patterns of communication in religion. The council began to achieve some of its goals. It helped to increase the number of professional communicators in religious service and to spur joint efforts. It helped to awaken the various faith groups to the potential of effective use of media. Part of that awakening was due to alterations in the media themselves. Big changes were occurring in newspaper handling, printing, broadcasting, including phasing out eventually of the linotype. Newspaper pages changed names from church to religion. The advent of television profoundly altered the last half of the 20th century. Activities by members of the Religious Publicity Council helped to make significant improvements in the coverage of religion by the mass media. More front-page stories began appearing. Broadcast and telecast treatment of religion changed unevenly, but generally for the better. Most media became more sensitive to the nuances of religious style and substance. RPC members advocated the use of available media and the employment of creativity in the process. Leadership in religion began to catch the vision of great good coming from more and better use of the media. During those earliest years, most Religious Publicity Council meetings and activities centered in New York City. In 1947, a chapter was organized in Washington, D.C., the first outside of New York. In 1948, most people learned a lesson from the great Chicago Tribune, not to count chickens before they're hatched. Then in 1949, the 20-year-old organization changed its name to reflect a broader scope of interest. It became the National Religious Publicity Council. In 1951, the council gave its first awards to the media, to the newspapers only. Awards to electronic media came along a decade later. Recognition of its own members began in 1967 with the DeRose Hinkhouse Awards. The 50s were a time of turmoil. The nation was at war again in Korea. The space age became a reality. Senator Joseph McCarthy and his anti-communist crusade targeted some religious organizations as leftists. By the 60s, the word publicity was much too narrow to cover the activities and interests of the membership. At an historic meeting in Chicago in 1963, the organization, after 14 years, changed the name again and became the Religious Public Relations Council. The tumultuous 60s demanded new ways of dialogue with the public. Church-state issues emerged. There was a confrontation with Cuba. The space program expanded. Leaders were assassinated. The war in Vietnam spread. Racial unrest grew. The nation's vice president, then the president, resigned. The communications challenge was immense. With available media expanding and diversifying, RPRC moved to diversify and enlarge its own circles. After 38 years of including only Protestant practitioners, in 1967, the membership was open to all Christian groups. 3 years later, in 1970, the membership was further expanded, widened to include all faith groups. In those days, the burgeoning public relations profession was generally and stereotypically viewed as male-dominated profession. In contrast, women were a major part of RPRC and its predecessor groups from the beginning. 7 of the 29 charter members were women. The first woman president was Elizabeth Husted of the American Bible Society, 1941-42. Women have continued to be in the forefront of the organization's leadership and life. In the 60s and 70s, religion became increasingly viewed as news and an appropriate arena for the practice of public relations. Major events helping to move those views along included denominational mergers and splits, new versions of the scriptures, such as the widely used Revised Standard Version. Hard news came from Supreme Court decisions. Legislation demanded attention on issues like prayer in the public schools, blue laws, racial restrictions, and abortion. In the 70s and 80s, national leadership changed. The most widely traveled pope in history was vocal and visible. The country celebrated its 200th birthday. A confrontation with Iran led to a year-long hostage situation for Americans in Iran. Use of drugs increased. The worldwide threat of AIDS and other pandemic diseases brought concern by all humanitarian groups. In the midst of all these changes, RPRC continued to broaden its general understanding and definition of communication. It gave priority to improving services to members, including professional growth opportunities. RPRC developed a new statement of professional aims and helped to back it up with better training for practitioners. The organization produced a film strip, The Church at Jackrabbit Junction. It published a series of practical handbooks on public relations, a handbook that's also available in Spanish. RPRC chapters have sponsored local workshops for congregations. A series of teleconferences has dealt with various phases of communication. Media Kit, a package of ideas and resources for professionals, became a valuable asset. The organization has regularly returned to Washington, D.C. for its 10-year anniversary celebrations, except for 1939. And here's the symbol for the 1989 meeting 10 years ago. During its first 3 1/4 decades, the council was simplicity itself. It had no staff. For the first years, the annual gathering was little more than an assembly of New York City members. Growth was slow but deliberate. One of the great spurs to development came in 1959 when Marvin C. Wilbur was given the official title of Executive Secretary. He served in that capacity without pay for 26 years until his retirement in 1985. RPRC honored this genial, faithful, persistent, and gifted man by naming its National Media Awards in his honor. Ann M. Riemel of Philadelphia followed as volunteer executive and has been a generous supporter. Others continue that tradition: J. Ron Byler, Robert Lear, Lois J. Anderson, plus many others who provide valuable volunteer services. Another major step has been the organization's leadership in establishing the 10-year cycle of International Interfaith Religious Communication Congresses. The first was in Chicago in 1970. The second and third were in Nashville in 1980 and 1990. The fourth will be RCC 2000, to be held in Chicago March 29 through April 1 next year. Again, 50 to 60 national and international organizations, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, Jewish, and others, are expected to participate with attendance around 2,000, many from outside the United States and Canada. After 35 years, in 1998, RPRC changed its name once more to Religion Communicators Council, reflecting the changing nomenclature of the times and the need to encompass the growing membership. In the 1980s and 90s, religious organizations and their communicators continued to deal with crises and opportunities. New steps were taken toward peace in the Middle East. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union fragmented. The Cold War ended. Major fighting occurred around the Persian Gulf. A crisis swirled around the presidency of the United States. And the challenge to communicators continues unabated. 1999 is the 70th year of the Religion Communicators Council. It is at the peak of its illustrious history. It has earned the respect and appreciation of people in kindred organizations. The methods, procedures, processes, and equipment, as well as the common understanding of effective communication, continues to evolve at breathtaking speed. We stand on the threshold of another decade in the life of the Council. We also face a new century and a new millennium As we do so, the communication challenge is essentially the same as it was at the beginning: to facilitate the life of religious faith among the multitudes, passing the sacred fire from heart to heart.